Today I'm going to go over some tips that will hopefully help you improve at the game. And the last one isn't as much a tip, but I think it's something that a lot of people don't consider, and it plays a much bigger factor than most people would think. The first one is going to be that we need to be worrying about our own setup before we worry about our opponent's setup or their lack of setup. This is particularly important when a card like Iono is very popular in the game, because it can be tempting sometimes to think that our opponent is dead drawing and just not play our Iono and hope that we can donk them, or that they're just completely bricking and we can win the game for free. But this can backfire in many ways. Our opponent could just not be playing any cards out of their hand because they have the perfect hand for next turn, or maybe they top deck something like a research on their next turn and we just held our Iono for no reason, just hoping that our opponent would brick, and made our own setup worse because of it. While it can feel bad to give our opponent a fresh 6 cards when we think they have nothing in their hand, sometimes it is just the best way to go. For the most part, I think it is better to worry about our own setup first, but there are some times when we might just want to hold on to the Iono, and that would be if we're in a really bad matchup and maybe we think that the only way that we can win is if our opponent draws bad, or if we already have a decent enough setup and good enough cards in our hand to do most of what we want next turn. Then those are good times to just hold on to the Iono and wait and see what our opponent is going to do. But if we have nothing else in hand other than our Iono, most of the time we're going to just have to play it, because we don't really want to get into a top deck war with our opponent, because then the game just comes completely down to luck. And for all we know, the next card on the top of their deck is a research, and they draw out of their bad hand first, and they're a whole turn ahead of us because of that. The next tip is going to be think more about thinning. I know I talk about this a lot on this channel, but I think it's something that's really important and can kind of help to counteract bad luck, because we're thinning extra cards out of our deck. We are more likely to draw better and therefore feel like we got a little bit luckier, or less likely to get quote unquote unlucky. And another thing that goes along with that is stop automatically discarding Ultra Ball within Ultra Ball. This can be really tempting. It can kind of feel like a free discard, but it's always worth considering if it actually is the right thing to do. And the same goes with stuff like Poffin and Nest Balls. These are cards that we could just play out of our hand without discarding them with Ultra Balls, so it's always worth taking an extra moment to consider if we have more cards in our hand that we could get rid of, and then just play the Nest Balls and the Poffins and thin those extra cards out of the deck. Another tip is it can be tempting to feel like we have to play a supporter card every single turn just because there's one in our hand, but this isn't always true. I think a good way to think about this is, do we have everything that we need in our hand for this current turn, and what might we need for next turn? Because there can be plenty of turns in games where we're not really looking for anything for the current turn, and this was one we're going to want to try and look ahead and consider what we're going to want next turn. A lot of the times it's just stuff like a boss's orders or a new evolution. But if we have everything that we need in our hand already, there really is no reason to play the supporter for the turn. Of course, there are other factors like disrupting our opponents and even just thinning our deck with stuff like research, but just know that it is not a requirement to play a supporter card just because it's in our hand. Speaking of supporter cards, this is going to be relevant as long as a card like Iono is in the format, but it can be really important to remember what is in our hand when we get Iono'd or play an Iono. And at a certain point, we can almost know like the bottom 10 or so cards of the deck. And that can be really helpful when deciding what order to play cards and our sequencing with other cards that shuffle the deck, or if we're more likely to draw what we're looking for by not shuffling the deck. And this is especially important at the end of the game when our deck is super thinned out. We can often have a pretty good idea of what we're going to draw into off of research, or if we get Iono'd. And I kind of hope that they keep a card like Iono in the game, not just for the disruption purposes, but because it brings a cool extra skill or interaction with getting to know some of the cards that are on the bottom of the deck. And the next tip is going to be to play more online tournaments. I know a lot of people kind of talk down about the limitless tournaments and stuff like that, calling them Mickeys, but they really are helpful for getting used to the tournament structure. Grinding the online ladder is going to be the most efficient when it comes to number of games played, but I just find that the online tournaments are really helpful for preparing for tournaments, especially for cups and challenges. Well, cups specifically because most online tournaments, especially the ones with over 100 people, which are the ones that I would recommend to look for and try to play, getting some good finishes in those bigger ones will make winning a cup seem a lot less daunting, because usually at a cup we just have to go like 302 and then win top 8, top 4 in the finals. But to win one of these online tournaments, typically I have to go 6-2-1 or 5-2-1 and then play a couple of rounds in the quote unquote day 2 segment and then play top cut. And getting used to playing all that just makes these other tournaments seem a lot easier. They're also good practice for regionals because they follow the same structure, they just don't get as many players. And while we're not going to be able to play as many games with these, we're more likely to hit more meta decks compared to the ladder. We might play against a lot of homebrew stuff, or just the ladder tends to have its own meta going on. So for preparing for a tournament and trying to figure out like targeted matchups with a deck, the limitless tournaments are probably going to be more helpful, but just learning a deck in general and being able to spam a bunch of games on the live ladder is probably going to be more helpful for that. And then this is going to help us with the next tip, which is try to figure out what matchups you might be struggling with a certain deck and play them from the other side. I know the generic tip is just play the same deck over and over again and get really good at it, and while that is probably the best way to go, that doesn't mean that there is no reason to learn to play other decks, at least at a very basic level, because knowing how to play a certain deck is going to make it easier to play against that deck, because we'll know what the deck is vulnerable to, and it helps with certain situations when we're trying to figure out which one of our opponent's Pokemon we should knock out. Well, if we know how to play that other deck pretty well, we're probably going to know which Pokemon they want to keep around the most, and then we could pick to knock that one out. And then another thing that kind of goes along with that, which this isn't the best meta for this right now, but I think learning how to play a control deck at a certain point for every player is going to be very helpful, because it just requires thinking about the game in a totally different way, which can end up being helpful with almost any deck. Unfortunately, control isn't in the best spot it's been in right now, but it will almost definitely have a time within the next year or so that at least a control deck will be good for a short amount of time. So keep an eye out for that and just try to practice with it. And it just kind of gives a whole new mindset on the game. And I think it'll be helpful for almost any player at around an intermediate level. And that's going to kind of lead into the next one, which is it's important to be honest with ourselves about where we're at in the game and what decks we should feel comfortable with. And this isn't to say that a certain player shouldn't play a certain deck, but if we're like a newer player trying to learn a harder deck, we just adjust our expectations and know that it's probably going to take a little while to get good at that deck and start winning tournaments with it. So it is important to be honest with ourselves, as well as trying not to blame losses on luck. While luck is a factor in any card game and it comes into play sometimes, it really isn't as big of a factor as I think players might think that it is. And a lot of the times there is some direct reason for why we got unlucky that we can figure out. So whenever I lose any game, I like to try and figure out what I did wrong to lead to me losing, because especially in this meta right now, almost any matchup is winnable and almost any player is going to make some mistake at some point. Even the best players in the world mess up, but most often we're not playing against the best players in the world, so it's almost guaranteed that they're going to misplay at some point, and there will be some type of way to take advantage of that. Try to just remember like any key decisions that seem like they were really important during a game, and if we lose, think back to what if I made this other decision that I didn't make. Try to kind of think out the line and what would have happened if we had made that decision. And this is where IRL testing can be really helpful, because we're able to actually go back to that point in the game and play it out from there and make the other decision and see what would happen. And also, yes, there are such things as bad matchups, but I keep saying this, especially at this point in the game. The game is like really pretty balanced right now. Even bad matchups aren't actually that bad. At worst, they're like 60-40, which that's like hardly unfavored. That's almost an even matchup. So try not to think that any matchup is unwinnable, and just always go into a game knowing that there is some type of way to win. That kind of leads on to the next point, or the last point, which is there is a mental aspect to the game, which I've kind of been thinking about quite a bit lately. I don't think that a lot of people might not recognize how important it is, but I think it plays a much bigger factor than most people think. And there's like a whole variety of things when it comes to this. One thing is nerves when playing. That can be nerves when playing a certain person or a certain matchup, or maybe as a new player just going to a tournament with a bunch of people and having to like sit down across from people that we might not know for like 30 minutes or an hour can kind of be a little bit anxiety inducing. So know that that is a factor in the game. And I wish I had like a good answer about how to deal with that, but maybe just knowing that that is a big factor in the game and that everyone experiences it can be kind of helpful. Another thing that goes along with that, which I think is one of my biggest problems, is just being in the current game that we're playing. This mostly applies to in real life tournaments or maybe even just tournaments in general, but it can be really easy to not even realize that we're thinking about the next round. Like if we start out 5-0, then we're playing in round 6 and just thinking about, well, if I just win this round, then I just got to win one more after that, and then I'm 7-0, I'm in a good spot for day 2. Like it can be pretty easy to let our mind just kind of wander like that, and just recognizing that it's a thing that happens and trying to stop it from happening and putting focus into the game that's going on can definitely be helpful. And the last thing that kind of goes in this section is never assume that a game is lost before it starts. Like I said earlier, this can be assuming that a matchup is lost or assuming that we're going to lose because we're playing against a specific person. That is just not a helpful mindset, and it's one of those things that's easier said than done, but almost any game is winnable. And if we go into the game already thinking that it's lost, we're not going to play as good, and we're less likely to see openings that we would see if we weren't thinking that way. Hopefully I said that in a way that makes sense, but yeah, I think that those are tips that could help any player. I've been thinking about this video for a while, so hopefully they were actually helpful tips. I didn't want to do like generic stuff like play a good deck and just like grind one deck over and over again. Everyone already knows those things. And yeah, hope you liked it. As always, a huge shout out to the channel members. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And like or dislike, comment, subscribe, take care, and have a good one.